All right, welcome back everyone to the final day one session of our Environmental Resilience for Economic Growth and National Security Policy Seminar. Great day so far, and I couldn't be more excited to conclude on this energy and environment session. I'm going to turn it over to today's student moderator, Carlos. Carlos, feel free to introduce yourself briefly and then introduce our panelists.
All right. Hi, my name is Carlos Marquez. I'm a student here at FAU, and I'm pursuing a BS in physics. And I have a lot of interest in energy efficiency and fusion energy and how the future of energy is going to look. So with the two panelists that we have today, we have, pardon if I don't pronounce your name right, Daniel Bresette and Chelsea Mervenne. Daniel Bresette serves as the Executive Director of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute in Washington, the EESI, a nonprofit education and policy organization. Before joining the EESI, Daniel serves as the Vice President of Policy at the Alliance to Save Energy, which also involves leading the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition as Executive Director. Previously, Daniel was the Maryland Energy Administration's Senior Energy Policy Manager and oversaw a diverse portfolio of state energy efficiency and financing initiatives. He has provided expert testimony to Congress, the Maryland General Assembly, and other regulatory agencies on energy efficiency topics. Daniel attended Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he earned a bachelor's degree in governmental and international relations. Later, he graduated from the University of Maryland with Robert H. Smith School of Business with a master's degree in business administration. Chelsea studied at the University of Michigan with a bachelor's on earth and environmental science and a master's in earth and environmental science, with 5 years combined of experience in environmental science, energy, stakeholder and community engagement and communications. Chelsea works for the ORISE Fellow in the Weatherization and intergovernmental programs within the U.S. Department of Energy and has worked previously within topics around Flint. So now I'd like to present some questions to the panelists. So Daniel, what do you think are some energy-related policies that are most important to combating climate change? And what are the economic implications of climate change?
Thanks, Carlos, and hi, everybody. Before I answer your question, let me just introduce Omri Laporte. He's the EESI logo, at least for me, down in the corner, and Amber Todoroff. Omri is our communications director. Anna is a senior associate with us working on the policy team and has a soft spot for Florida. She's a Floridian, so she likes to keep track of all things Floridian. And I like to say it internally that she's our Florida sympathizer. When you get out of Florida, it's a wonderful state, but we make fun of you, especially in the Northeast where I'm from. So just teasing a little bit, but thank you so much for the chance to be with you today. It's a great question, Carlos, and it's a two-parter. So I'll take the first part first. There are pretty much a limitless number of energy-related policies when it comes to combating climate change. Climate change in a lot of ways is a result of how we use and consume and extract energy from Earth. If you think about where emissions come from, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, SOx, NOx, all of the different pollutants that are in our atmosphere that cause us problems. An awful lot of them come from 5 sectors of the US economy. One of them is energy generation, so where our electricity comes from. Another is transportation, which is actually the most critical and highest emitting sector right now. Also buildings, not just the materials that go into constructing our buildings, but actually how we use our buildings. And of course, we spend a lot of time in buildings. It looks like we're all in buildings today. We're all using electricity and perhaps thermal energy. Also agriculture. Agriculture is how we use the land for sure, but also how we affect the land's ability to store carbon dioxide and how we use the land to derive food and other resources and their choices that we make. Some people cite climate change as a reason, say, for being vegetarian or vegan, because, for instance, eating meat actually has a pretty high emissions profile. And then the last one is a real big one and also maybe the most complicated, and that's industry. So we're not talking about necessarily manufacturing small things, but the processes that are required to make chemicals, to make concrete, to make steel. Heavy industry is extremely heat intensive and it's therefore extremely carbon intensive. And without any of those five, you can imagine what our modern world would look like. So the tie between, the connection between how we use energy and climate change is really, really closely, they're almost inextricable. Because of that, we like to say at EESI that climate change is an economy-wide problem. There aren't really any sectors of our economy in 2021 in the United States that are really separable from the challenge of climate change. And so we look very closely at economy-wide solutions. I'm sure in the news you're hearing about things like clean energy standards, you're hearing about cap and trade, you're hearing about carbon tax, things that can be applied sort of from the top-down economy level. But we're also very interested in sector-specific solutions. So many of you are probably learning about electric vehicles. That's a way to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. Energy efficient appliances and equipment. It's a way to reduce emissions from the building sector. Manufacturing improvements. And you can kind of go through the rest of the list. So there are sector-specific things that would add up to a lot of emissions, but you can't just deal with one sector because it really does come from all over. And if you think about how large the US economy is, it's a lot, it's huge, it's diverse, and we're the largest, but we're only one economy. And so thinking about not just these problems from a US economic perspective, but also China has a pretty big economy. Europe has a pretty big economy. The other countries of BRIC, Russia, India, and Brazil have pretty big economies. Indonesia has a pretty big economy. And so when you think about all of those different economy-wide solutions, all those potential sector solutions, it's a really, really big problem. So that's a little bit, that's an extremely high-level overview. But I'm trying really hard to stay an even distance from the microphone. That's a problem to take up with Michael Dell. I'm trying really hard to be disciplined and stay an even, I think about 10 inches from the mic. So hopefully that's not too much of a problem. Thank you for telling me about that, Eric. But I'll stop there and let Chelsea go. Or turn it back over to you, Carlos, I should say.
Oh, no worries. So Chelsea, could you tell us about your experience that has led you to your interest in the energy sector and how you keep your energy work rooted in environmental justice?
Yes, thank you. Thank you guys for having me here. To answer your question, so my interest in energy specifically kind of came about in a roundabout way. So as you were mentioning at the beginning when you were reading my bio, I worked with EPA in Flint for the Superfund division. So that's working with communities that have been affected by hazardous waste. And there I worked to involve people in the decision-making process. After that, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I had the opportunity to work on a project that was focused on energy in Puerto Rico. So that project was looking at microgrids, renewable energy microgrids. And if you're not familiar with what a microgrid is, it's effectively a smaller version of an electric grid that's more localized. And it can operate when, say there's a power outage, from the main electricity producer that can function independently. So avoiding some of those issues at critical facilities like hospitals and firehouses and things like that we saw after Hurricane Maria as real problem areas for the Puerto Rico grid. And that for me kind of opened my eyes to all of the different opportunities that existed within the energy space. I was interested in how some of these technologies that I hadn't really been familiar with before could be used to solve some of the most challenging energy problems that we have right now as part of the solution to climate change and part of improving resilience to severe storms. And within that, equity is embedded. It has to be embedded, right? Because you think of Puerto Rico and how fragile their energy grid has been, how little support they've gotten from, the US government in terms of keeping that a sustainable operation. So where I work at Department of Energy right now, I'm mostly focusing on intergovernmental programs and technical assistance. So helping partners to decide what types of technology that they would need to make their operations more efficient, and kind of help them step by step along the way. And the way I think about equity and energy justice within that is that instead of seeing it as a separate entity, looking at it like almost like we look at budgeting, where it's something that you can look at independently, but really you can't think about a project without also thinking about budgeting within that. So in that same vein, you can't look at a project without also thinking about, how is this going to impact the communities that I'm trying to serve? How am I going to make sure that no one is bearing a disproportionate burden of the negative impacts of what's going on? So it's just making sure to have a holistic viewpoint is, I would say, the best way to go about ensuring equity as part of those initiatives.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. And then in that case, you mentioned Flint, so I just wanted to ask, I know our group is very interested in about environmental justice. So I just wanted to ask you more about the environmental issues in Flint rose to a level of national consciousness. So if you could tell us more about your experience working there and the importance that you felt to get involved within that community and how you can stay involved even in your position now in Washington.
Absolutely. So going back to, I guess, when I was in graduate school. So I was born and raised in Michigan. So I was always kind of familiar with the different environmental challenges that were going on in the state. When I was finishing grad school was at the height of the Flint water crisis. And I studied a very technical field, environmental geochemistry. And communication isn't really something that's stressed within the hard sciences, for better or for worse. And it was the Flint water crisis that had me realize that there is this disconnect in communication between scientists and policymakers and the public, because a lot of, there are dozens of different things that led to the situation we saw in Flint, but the breakdown in communication was a huge part of that. And so for me, I realized, okay, I have the technical background. Where do I go about getting a better understanding of how to make sure that this information is communicated to the people that need that information? And that's where I found the ORISE fellowship, which is a fellowship where I was able to serve with EPA, specifically in their community involvement program. So that's where I worked with, how I ended up in Flint. I moved there, I lived there, and I basically embedded myself in the community to get to know people and hear from them on a, everyday level, what their concerns were, and try to build trust so that they felt they could ask me questions. I could give them the information that they were looking for, and make sure that they had the vocabulary they needed to be able to speak to decision makers in a way that they could get the information that they wanted and be able to be part of the decision-making process, if that makes sense. So, Flint is still, sorry, my cat keeps trying to come onto the computer. Flint is still, it's really the canary in the coal mine in terms of water equity, especially in Flint, which is a majority Black city. That, the response time for the state and for the federal government to respond was a lot longer than maybe it would have been had it been a wealthier city. So, I think now in my current position, I don't have as much, I don't really interface with that project or that issue as much, but it is definitely something, the lessons that I learned there and the core elements of community engagement and making sure people on the ground are involved at every step of the decision-making process is something that I've brought to my position at DOE. I hope that answers your question.
It did. Thank you very much, Chelsea. Hopefully, Dan, hopefully your microphone is better. Okay. So I had a question for you, Daniel, about what are the highlights of the EESI's report on sustainable and coastal communities, given that our group is specialized here in Miami, Florida, since we're like an FIU. So if you could give us like an insight about the report.
Hopefully this is a little bit better. This microphone can be a little touchy, so hopefully it's a little bit better. I'll keep it right there. So I'm going to use this question as a way to plug the report, and I'm going to put a link in the chat for everyone if that's allowed. So yes, see, here we go. So it's almost not even possible to say what the highlights are, because this report is basically just all highlights, and I'm only saying that somewhat facetiously. ESI's main line of business is congressional education. And so our job is to present information to policymakers that they need or their staff need to do their business, to work on bills, to hold hearings, to answer their constituents' concerns. We do that in lots of different ways. And I'll promise this is going to be relevant in just a second. We write lots of articles, we do fact sheets, we also do a lot of briefings. And so just in general, ESI probably has covered issues that you all are studying in your coursework. And so it's a great resource. If you're not already availing yourself of it, you should sign up for our newsletter. Amber happens to be our editor, Climate Change Solutions. It comes out every 2 weeks. But we have, I'm pretty sure I could pick any of you and I could say, what was the latest clean energy topic or climate topic that you worked on? And I bet we've covered that issue within the last 24 months. I would say there's a very high probability of that. One of our most ambitious briefing series was over the course of 2019 and 2020. We did 16 briefings on coastal resilience. And we covered Florida in a couple different briefings. We looked, in fact, Representative Francis Rooney, former member from Florida, actually sponsored one of ours and one of our briefings. And what we did was we tried to gather success stories and tried to bring together experts and practitioners from all the coastal regions. So Maine, Alaska, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Hawaii, California, Louisiana, the Great Lakes, all of the coastal regions. And thank you, Vanessa. And tried to bring all of these people together so that we could share stories of what was happening in terms of coastal resilience all across the country. And it dawned on us as we were sort of approaching the halfway mark of the briefing series is that this information was awesome. These stories were compelling. The panelists were making amazing progress on the ground. They were using resources from the federal government and others very creatively, and they were making a lot of progress in improving the resilience of their communities. And so that was how we came upon this idea to compile this big report. And what we did was we went back all over the 16 briefings, 42 panelists, and it took, I think it was about 14 months worth of briefings. And we sort of we identified every finding, every recommendation we could possibly find. We pulled those all together and we organized them so that it's very usable for a congressional audience. So if you open the document, we go through all 30 recommendations. We explain what the recommendation is. We give a case study about how it's being put into practice or a case study that demonstrates why this is an issue that's worthy of additional attention. And then we make recommendations. So in some cases, the federal government needs to make climate data more accessible to people. In some cases, it needs to fund these programs. In some cases, it needs to expand the definition of eligible activity for different programs. And then we organized it, what we call slicing and dicing. We sliced and diced it up. So if you're a staff person who's primarily interested in funding, here are all the funding recommendations. If you're a staff person specifically interested in traditional ecological knowledge, here are all the relevant recommendations. So it's a really comprehensive document. It came out last October. As far as highlights, I'll share a couple things that I learned. The first was one of the things that makes or breaks coastal resilience efforts is community engagement. And what that means is not just sending out flyers or putting ads in newspapers or passively sharing information about how to participate in these programs. What it really means is going out and making sure that the people who need to have their voices heard are invited, they're made to feel welcome. The information is finding them through a trusted channel source that they can relate to, it makes all the difference in the world. There was a guy, his name was Donald Bogan. He's an elder in his church in coastal Louisiana, one of our coastal Louisiana briefings, really incredible panelist. And he put it perfectly. He said, the way the Louisiana project that he was working with, the way that they went about community engagement made him feel like he was part of the decision. He wasn't just told after the fact what the decision was. And that's really compelling. And I think that's one thing that really, really, really stuck with me over the course of the briefing series and in the report. Another thing that I learned, climate data. There is I don't want to say limitless, there is a huge amount of climate data available. And we actually, Amber came up with this great idea last April to do a climate adaptation data week. So we did 5 briefings back to back every day at noon, and everything's available online if you want to go back and look at it. And we covered climate adaptation data from 5 different perspectives and had all these panelists in. It was super cool. The problem is that if you're not a climate scientist, sometimes it can be very difficult to know what the data is, to know how to use it, to know how to incorporate it into your decision making. And so there are a lot of really interesting efforts at the federal government, but also in different regional offices of nonprofits and state entities and things like that, that really try to make that data accessible so that when a city council person or a nonprofit leader in, say, coastal Michigan, to use Michigan as an example, or Florida, is trying to figure out how to inform their local policymaking or local decision-making, they don't have to have a PhD in climate scientist. They don't have to be an ecologist. They don't have to be a biologist. They can just be an ordinary person who is then able to take that information and do something with it. And then the last thing I'll highlight, which is probably the thing I knew the least about, was the role of indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge. This is something that really came up during our Hawaii briefing, well, Hawaii too, actually, but I was thinking of Alaska, and then the Great Lakes. And so we had folks who were either representatives of tribes or who worked with indigenous communities. And it was really interesting listening to them talk about how their information has relevance. And so when 21st century scientists are trying to figure out what sea level rise will look like in 25 years, actually, there's a really, really good argument for going back and finding people from the community who've lived there for generations who can share information about what that is. And the right way to then sort of go through that process is by including that. It's a really, really interesting thing. There was one person, Rob, who worked with one of the Great Lakes tribes. And he was talking about how food, tribes that have lived around the Great Lakes have used sort of lake ecosystems as a source of food for generations and generations, and that's changed over time. The wild rice and things that his ancestors or community's ancestors used to eat isn't there anymore. That's really interesting. Climate scientists should probably know that. They should probably be able to build that in, not just to their modeling, but also their adaptation. How are we going to live? How are we going to continue living in this space if we don't have an appreciation and an understanding of how people lived there before? So that's just a taste of what's in the report. There's all sorts of really great stuff in it. I would love to hope that it's a resource for you all in your schoolwork. And the briefings were really, really great. If you wanted to learn about how financing can be used in resilience, that's the Hawaii briefing. We did a 3-part series on Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands to learn about how people recover from disasters while also trying to make themselves resistant to future disasters. It's a really big challenge in Puerto Rico. Maria wasn't that long ago, and there's still a lot that needs to be done on the ground while they're also trying to think about what comes next and to try to be prepared. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Daniel. We're open for questions from our group, and I can see Jonathan raised his hand. So,
yeah, good afternoon, Dan and Chelsea. My name is Jonathan Ramirez. I'm a student of the Master of Arts in Global Affairs. And well, first of all, thank you for being here, for share your experience. And I would like to ask about a specific point that I found on the article that says the U.S. leadership is essential. So you mentioned how the U.S. needs to take back that leading role in the climate change and everything else. So I was wondering, when we come back to the Paris Agreement, sorry, what do you think is the future for our country? I mean, with this new government, do you think there's going to be definitely improvement? There is things that we need to work on, like your general considerations.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll share a little bit, Jonathan, thanks for your question, a little bit about how ESI approaches that. So one of the first things President Biden did on his inauguration day was sign back up to the Paris Agreement. But 4 years had gone by. And so I think a good way to think about your question, how to answer it, is to think about what happened in those 4 years and how US leadership might have changed what happened in those 4 years. So the first thing that happened in 4 years is climate change got worse. We didn't make the progress we needed to be making in the years 2017 through 2020. And those are years we can't get back. Those are emissions that are in the atmosphere. It's a cumulative problem. And so there's a great joke in The Simpsons where people are digging down to save Bart from the well in one of the early seasons. And Chief Wiggum says, no, that's not the answer to the problem. Dig up. There's no such thing as digging up. Digging only goes in one direction. And you can either choose to stop digging, or you can continue to make the hole deeper. And unfortunately, we chose to make the hole a little bit deeper. So that's one thing. Another thing is the United States is important as a marker of what's acceptable. And so when you had the United States go from being front and center in establishing the Paris Agreement, we all remember John Kerry, Ernest Moniz, obviously President Obama, and others who were back in that 2014, 2015 timeframe. The United States had a very, very prominent role, and it makes it harder for other sort of large powers like China and Europe, Brazil, the countries we've talked about a little bit before, to not also want to have a large role when the United States is having a large role. When the United States stop having a large role, it makes it a lot easier for other countries to say, well, they're not going to take it seriously. So it definitely reduces the amount of momentum that and a lot of what led to the Paris Agreement happening was momentum. It was not something that happened overnight. It was something that built over decades. So those are a couple of things. I think having the United States back will, one, it will motivate climate policy and investments in infrastructure and things like that here in the United States. So that's one good thing. Another thing is we will update our NDC, our nationally determined commitment. That's scheduled to happen in a few weeks. And we will be, that will be a new marker for other countries to compare themselves to. And I think also people like to talk about climate policy as a set of sacrifices. And that's not how I typically like to think about them. I don't think about them so much as trade-offs as trade-ups. But there will be things that have to change. And it will be a lot easier for us to have that change happen at a global level if we're willing to have that change here. Otherwise, it's very easy to come across as hypocritical. So I think what's happened to date in this administration is very important, but the next 3 3/4 years will be really, really important. One thing, I don't mean to take too long, but one thing that was very important that did happen in those 4 years, we tend to think about US climate policy as a federal issue. And that's true, it is. But the United States, actually most energy policy is state and local. And a lot of states and a lot of cities, in fact, some of the largest cities and the largest states never took their foot off the pedal, electric vehicle pedal, while the US government wasn't expressing itself in a leadership role. So not all was lost, but it's a lot easier for the rest of the world to see a coordinated, or at least a on the same page approach when it comes to the federal government, state government, and local governments. Having that federal piece missing is it's not good. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, Kristin has another question. So.
Hi, guys. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. And I feel like there's just so many questions that could be asked. There's you guys are sharing so many resources already that I'm kind of scrolling through, and there's a lot there already. So thank you for all that. And I guess my question is kind of open to either of you, maybe more towards Chelsea, but it's also kind of maybe a little technical. My background, I'm a graduate student here at FIU, have a background in biology, and I'm kind of switching to geosciences. So I'm really interested in sort of the biogeochemical side of things. And so I don't know all that much about renewable energy, but I was interested in what you guys think, what new technologies, it seems like there's sort of a nascent market, right, kind of coming. I mean, that's going to obviously, hopefully grow, as far as renewable energy sources. And I'm curious, like, what Chelsea said about different grid scales and how that relates to resilience and also even equity. I found that really interesting because that seems like also a way of incorporating like different types of technologies. And it seems like having those different scales would almost be necessary to have a diversity of energy sources or renewable energy sources. So yeah, I'm curious about that intersection sort of between environmental resilience and equity, and maybe different strategies or technologies that you think tie into that. And that's kind of a big question.
Yeah, it's definitely a big question. And I think a lot of municipalities are grappling with that question right now. One thing that I would recommend, if that's, in terms of scaling and what that process can look like while incorporating equity and, community engagement, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory just put out a study. It's been a multi-year study. I think, costs well over, $3 billion in terms of the amount of investment. And they worked with the city of Los Angeles to see what renewable energy technologies would best be suited for their transition to 100% clean energy or 100% clean economy. And that was released 2 weeks ago now. It's super comprehensive. Even just the summary, I think, is like 60 pages, which just tells you how ridiculous it is. But in terms of, the different types of technologies that are out there, it's just incredible the amount of diversity that exists with these technologies. So I work a lot, for example, with wastewater treatment facilities, and you'll see some wastewater treatment facilities using the methane that they put off that is produced from the wastewater treatment to create renewable natural gas to power some of their vehicles or power their own operations so that they're independent of the grid. So things like that. I don't think I'm going to be able to get at the full scope of your question. I think Dan might be able to add a little bit onto that, but just I'll post a link to that study.
That study sounds like very much, yeah, just exactly kind of what I was thinking, what it would take to have that transition, because that seems like that's the big question right now. Thank you so much.
Oh, Dan, I think
we can't hear.
Yeah, Dan, I think you're
sorry. The DOE has so many amazing resources, and the national labs are just the best. There's all sorts of amazing reports on all sorts of these topics. Two quick things. One, there is a lot of stock to be put in new technologies, emerging technologies, things like that. And there are things, batteries are a great example. Batteries are becoming better and better, while at the same time they're becoming cheaper and cheaper. Same thing happened with solar panels 10, 15 years ago. And there'll be new things for sure. But there's an awful lot of stuff that's old, tried and true, stuff that we don't need to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again. And a lot of the stuff that we can do is sometimes the simplest. A lot of the things we can do are behavior, how we interact with our settings, buildings and vehicles and things like that. So I think there are definitely things on both sort of ends of the spectrum, old and new. When it comes to equity and accessibility and environmental justice, making what's currently available, making the tried and true, the stuff that doesn't take a lot of work, making that as widely available as possible is a very good thing. We were talking about this morning in one of our internal meetings, talking about broadband. Broadband is great for energy efficiency. It's great for renewable energy, but you know what? It's even better for working from home and from learning from home and from having a small business at home. And it's, there's a lot of, there are a lot of things that can be unlocked with that. But if not everybody's, if it's not available to everyone, if everyone can't afford it, if that infrastructure is not there and companies aren't willing to make that last mile investment, it doesn't matter because it's not affecting them or they're not available to them. And then on the new technologies, also, it's making sure that they're deployed in a way that's not just serving, the middle and upper classes around large cities, to make these things available to rural communities, communities of color, disadvantaged communities, frontline communities. And that's not something that happens accidentally. That requires a lot of purpose. And it requires a lot of thoughtfulness about incentives. It requires a lot of thoughtfulness about making the business case, and making sure that these things, are happening on a time scale that's accessible. So, yeah, I mean, there is, again, pretty much, Kristin, if you put a renewable energy topic into the search box at eesi.org, I'm sure you'll learn all about sort of what we've said about other things, but just wanted to share those comments.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, since I don't think anybody else has their hand up quite yet, I definitely appreciate that, what you said, especially about the scale and everything, and how it's not necessarily about new technologies, but just using these tried and true, like Chelsea's example about methane, and just having sort of more just scaling systems, and maybe it's almost more about using what you have there. For example, like, on the coast, maybe we would, the ocean, currents and all that would be more of a viable option. So yeah, it's not so much about using new technologies, but how we approach designing those new systems and sort of making them fit for equity and for what we have there and what's like the easiest solution. We were sort of having a discussion before about how a lot of this and educating people on being more sustainable and having, making those changes in their kind of day-to-day consumption habits or lifestyle. It's more of returning to the roots, and it's very intuitive, and there's a lot of kind of easy solutions, but we tend to think that it's this big daunting task to sort of switch to that. So yeah, we've been discussing that too.
Thank you for panelists. I think now I'd like to ask, well, in general, for both you, Daniel, and Chelsea, about our group is interested on what internships, fellowships, and early career opportunities exist at your organization, and some of the career advices that you can give to the students here.
Sure. So in terms of kind of getting your foot in the door for these types of energy related positions, I would highly recommend ORISE, which is the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. I'll post a link to their portal, but it has not just internships and fellowships at DOE, but also at EPA, Department of Agriculture, all across, NOAA, most of the science-oriented government agencies. And you'll be able to see the specific project that they're hoping that you'll be working on. So you, even in going through those postings, it kind of gives you even more of an idea of the possibilities that are out there. For me, when I graduated, that was one of the things that I felt was missing. I had no idea what opportunities were out there or even where to start looking. So this is an excellent way to do that. There are a couple, there's the ORISE fellowship, there's the AAAS fellowship, which is a science and engineering oriented fellowship for connecting kind of communities with science in government agencies. I would start there, and I'll pass it to Dan.
And do whatever you did before to re-get your.
And it's amazing. I was just saying, I'm sorry, my mic. It's part of the fun of being online. Last couple of years, I've been on the selection committee for AAAS, for the executive branch fellowships. And oh boy, are there some wonderful positions available at the federal level for really, really smart scientists. But also this year, lots of anthropologists came through, people on the social sciences. Very interesting. They definitely skew hard science, but by no means is it limited to that. So we have at ESI, we have 3 sort of cohorts of interns every year. We're actually interviewing our summer candidates right now. And we'll also have probably 4 interns in the fall, and then probably 4 interns in the spring. We actually have 5 interns right now for a couple different reasons, but it's a great way to come to DC, and there will be a time to come to DC. Our summer interns, I don't think will be in person, but everyone's been remote. We paid $15 an hour. That's very important to me. I got my first internship. I wouldn't have been able to take it if I hadn't gotten paid. So that's not even a question at EESI. It's a great way to get experience and to get some things on your resume, and it's fun. We do, however, I should point out that we do aim for, and we do design our internships for undergraduates. So we are looking for folks who are in that junior, senior timeframe, and there are lots of reasons for that. But I think there are some exceptions that have been made, but I would say for the last couple cycles, we've been aiming. We also, from time to time, post jobs. We're a small organization, so we don't do a lot of hiring, although we are actually currently hiring. We have interviews this week for a new associate, and we just hired one last week or the week before. Couple things that I would just recommend. One is I take it that you all are in Florida, and that in a normal year you would have traveled to DC, and that's great. Even if you're not able to physically be here, if you find someone who's doing interesting work, ask them to have a conversation. I bet they will take you up on it, and they'll give you a lot of great insight into what they're doing. But you can't be afraid to ask. Networking is something that is just part of the way things work, and it doesn't have to be weird or awkward. It's not about that. And so no one's good at it at first at all. But everybody gets to where they've been because people have been nice to them, and people have given them information, and people have taken the time. So you're never going to benefit from it if you don't ask. And maybe you'll find someone who's a jerk and will take you up on it, but I would be surprised if that happens. Another quick thing, there is a myth that resumes have to be 1 page. So dispel that right now. But I've read lots and lots of resumes lately because we've been doing so much hiring. And Omri has read tons and tons of resumes lately. Amber has read tons and tons of resumes lately. You know what sticks out to me is when I read a resume, the person tells me what they will do, not what they've done, but who they are and what they'll do in the job. That's really important. I don't want to pick any fights with any Miami Dolphins fans, but I'm a Patriots fan. I'm a New Englander. And Bill Belichick, he pays football players for what they're going to do, not for what they've done. And that's my philosophy too. And so when I read your resume, I want to know what you're going to do for me and my organization, how you're going to help us succeed, and how you're going to fit in. Those are all very, very important points to me. In fact, someone a lot smarter than me said there are only 3 questions in an interview. Can you do the work? Will you love doing the work? And can I stand being around you? And those are absolutely the most important things. And resumes are really, really helpful, actually, if you can right at the top, name, address, education. Before you even get to education, who are you? Are you an ecologist? Are you a marine biologist? Are you a passionate communicator? Tell me who you are and help me understand everything that I'm about to read, how that's going to fit in. And trust me, it helps a lot figuring out. It takes away all the guesswork. I don't have to put anything together. It's there for me. And it's true. The time people spend reading resumes is measured more often in seconds than it is in minutes, and it's never measured in hours. So if you don't come across very well at first, it's going to be a lot harder. But there's a lot of great opportunity in DC. It's a great place. It's not the only place you can make a difference. And so if you're thinking, well, actually, I don't really want to leave Florida, you don't have to leave Florida. If you want to go back to where you're from, fine. There's all sorts of cool stuff that you could do, all sorts of great companies to work for, all sorts of great nonprofits, all sorts of state and local governments. I spent 6 years in state government and learned more than I could ever have learned anywhere else. It's an amazing experience, including working with people from Office of Weatherization and intergovernmental programs. I got lots of grant dollars from them when I was in Maryland, and it's really, really important. So I'll leave it there. I'll speak for myself, not Omri or Amber, but my guess is that you all have our contact information. If you wanted to follow up or get extra information, you're always welcome to find me on LinkedIn or send an email or make a call, and I'll do my best to get back to you.
Yeah, and I would second that for myself. If you have my contact info, or if, I think Eric has the contact info, and he can
If
share
you're
with
telling
you
me,
all.
if you guys are telling me I can give them out, I'm going to put them in the chat right now.
Yeah, absolutely. For speaking for myself, absolutely. And I'm more than happy to talk to folks if you have questions about DOE or anything like that, or if I can put you in contact with someone who's working on stuff that you're more aligned with. I'm more than happy to do that as well.
Thank you very much. We have some students who have other questions. Nadia, I know Vanessa had a question, but I don't know what happened. So Nadia, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Carlos. Chelsea, Dan, thank you so much for your time. My name is Nadia Seeteram, and I'm a PhD candidate at FIU. I study more climate migration, sea level rise adaptation work in that policy area. So Dan, I actually had a question for you because I recalled something that you said earlier in this session, that your job is to sort of provide information for Congress. And it sort of reminded me a little bit of the Congressional Research Service and their purpose as well. And so I kind of wondered, you know, how does that process go about? Do you kind of just like give Congress information, or are you requested by Congress? How do you facilitate those discussions?
That's a great question. So Congressional Research Service, CRS, is a part of the government. They're part of the Library of Congress, and their specific role is to provide objective, timely information to members at their request. When I worked on the Hill, I used CRS all the time. They're wonderful. Their analysts are awesome. And they cover the full range of congressional issues. So even though I mainly worked on them with agriculture and energy, if you wanted to learn about, you know, food stamp policy, well, there's someone at CRS who's an expert in that. Or if you want to learn about how the budget process works, there's a CRS analyst in that. But they're not allowed to make recommendations. They're not really allowed to do anything sort of, they're allowed to talk about the present tense, but they don't really get to ever talk about the future tense. And so they're really about sort of laying a foundation of information. They're also different from the Congressional Budget Office. So you're not going to get sort of comprehensive budget estimates, and then they're always wrong, but you still have to have an estimate from CRS like you would for CBO. They're also not the Government Accountability Office. So they're not out there looking for risks to slap or mistakes that were made, or here's what went wrong. That's not their job. But what they do is amazing, and Congress really would have a harder time functioning without them. EESI's role is very different. We actually started as a caucus of Congress. We were founded on a bipartisan basis in 1984 by members of Congress. And the idea was that EESI would be this entity that would provide sort of additional climate information, specifically around climate change, energy, things like that. There are caucuses that do that today. There's a Sustainability and Energy Efficiency Caucus that still does this type of work. But over time, we were spun off into an independent 501c3. And so right now, our role is going sort of, I wouldn't say we pick up where CRS leaves off. We're quite different. And we do have an agenda. We would very much like to see a just transition to a decarbonized clean energy economy. CRS does, they may feel that way personally, but that's not their mission. And so what we try to do is we try to figure out what we think Congress needs to do its job, and then to go give it to them. And so we do take requests for sure. It happens quite a bit where a member will, or their staff more likely, will call up and say, hey, I have a question about this. Can you help us understand this issue? And for sure, we will do our best to, put an article out, or perhaps a fact sheet, or hold a briefing on it. But really, we sort of use our judgment about what they need. And so I'll use an example to give you an idea of what that looks like in practice that actually also leverage CRS. We're all stuck in our homes. And if in a normal year, the first 6 months of a new Congress, we're in the 117th Congress, last Congress was the 116th Congress, the first 6 months of a new Congress, and the first 6 months of a new administration, EESI, we'd be wearing out our shoes. We'd just be blowing through shoes up on Capitol Hill, meeting with every office, bringing all this information up to them. But we can't do that right now. So we're having to find a way to do that, bring that information to them in a virtual way. And so we've done Congressional Climate Camp, which is a 4.5, soon to be 5-part series of really extensive briefings where we over a 2-hour period, bring all these experts and all of this information, and we slice it and dice it up into little chunks, and we release it as podcasts, and we send written summaries to try to get the information, not that Congress knows that they need, but that we know Congress needs. So the first one, we looked at budget appropriations and stimulus and had a CRS expert actually join us to explain the budget process. The second one was about profiles of top emitting sectors. So we gave congressional staff an idea. Here's those 5 sectors I explained at the beginning. Here's what their emissions profile looks like, and here's what we need to do about it. The third one, which was just 2 weeks ago, March 26th, was we did current attitudes and sort of turning points in climate policy. So we went all the way back to 1990 and walked people through some really interesting developments in climate policy, and then talked to a professor from Northwestern about bipartisanship and compromise and what that actually looks like. And then the next one, which will be at the end of April, is going to be on double whammies. So things we can do in the near term that give us mitigation and adaptation benefits. So things like mass timber, nature-based solutions, building energy codes, and agriculture, like cover crop practices. So what we do, we try to give the Congress the information they need. We try to predict what they're going to want to know, and then we deliver it, and we try to make it relevant and timely. So it's different, but it's fun, and it's fun to be part of the ecosystem, and it's fun to be part of the broader advocacy community. And it's also fun to be hopeful, and Congress is a fascinating place. It's where things happen, or more often don't happen, but when things happen, it's pretty fun to be a part of.
Thank you so much.
And then one of our final questions, Vanessa, you can go ahead.
Hi, Dan and Chelsea. Thank you so much for your time. I am a undergrad at FIU. I'm studying environmental studies, and I'm super interested in environmental justice. So Dan, I have a question for you. Having experience in being a policy leader, strategist, and implementer, I was wondering if you could speak to the most challenging aspect of implementing policy.
Well, that's a really tough question. I'll say I'll have a couple ways that I'll answer it. So one, our process is basically set up not to work. Our process is set up to be slow and deliberate. And so sometimes there's an incompatibility with that, with something like climate change. We've been in a pandemic. And even with all of the motivation of the last year, think about how long it took for the rescue plan to get passed. It takes a long time to get stuff done. And so one of the really challenging things about policymaking is that you have to stick to it. Very few things pop up and happen. They require a lot of work over a long period of time, and they require support from lots of different parties, lots of different constituencies. And that's very frustrating, because good stuff doesn't happen. Good stuff gets laid by the wayside. If you follow ESI's legislative tracker, thousands of bills are introduced every year. Maybe a couple hundred pass, maybe. And a bunch of those are must pass bills where there's not really a choice. So it's a really tough process. Part of that challenge also is understanding sort of where your opportunities are, and thinking ahead. Amber and I are working very hard right now, getting ready for this appropriation season. So fiscal year 22, the fiscal year that starts in October. And we're thinking about what requests and what recommendations we'll make. But our ambitions are significant, but what we're probably going to be requesting this year are relatively modest steps forward. So we're really trying to pick and choose where we're going to target. I'm not going to give anything away because we haven't figured everything out yet, but we can't change everything overnight, but we might be able to make some progress in some key areas. And we might be able to make some friends while we're doing it. And that might tee us up for more success next year. You mentioned environmental justice, Vanessa. I think one of the challenges specific to that topic is finding ways to convey how elemental it is and how organic those considerations are to most of the other policy issues. There was a time not that long ago when it was treated as an amendment. It was treated as an add-on. It was treated as something that sort of an also ran. And one thing that we've tried really hard at ESI to think about over the last 2 years or so is how do we incorporate that issue in a way that makes sense and that you almost don't even realize you're learning about environmental justice because it's just so, it reflects the reality. It's just integrated into how this stuff works. So rather, when we're talking about, say, I'm trying to think of a good example, we're talking about coastal resilience, lots of environmental justice considerations in coastal resilience. It makes a lot of sense to have multiple panelists who can talk about that experience, again, in an organic way so that it comes across cleanly. And I think that's going to be, that's something that we are thinking a lot about because the challenges of policymaking, it's actually hard to get stuff done if there are people who are identified as left out or are not being brought along. It's possible. Tax cuts bill a couple years ago, good example, no child left behind, it happens. But especially when the Democrats are in control of Congress and the presidency, making that a really key part of your arguments and doing it in a genuine way that doesn't feel like you're just trying to score points is actually really, really important. And it's a real challenge because it's not usually the way climate information is conveyed to staff. It's something that I think ESI is trying to do that's a little bit different.
And to add on to that really quickly, I know we only have a couple minutes. Speaking from the government side, one of the things that I've encountered is that people don't really know what environmental justice means. So defining what that is so that everyone's on the same page, because there's a lot of jargon around it, because it's an important topic, but we're really trying to coalesce around what it is at its core. So that's one of the things that presents as a challenge to incorporating it into policy. After we get to the point where we can define what it is, determining how do we measure that is also a challenge. For example, in my office, how are we defining an underserved community? Are we using low income? Are we using a combination of income and race and environmental factors? Things like that also present as one of those essential challenges that I think a lot of folks are grappling with right now.
Thank you. I don't know if Chelsea, if you have a few minutes. I know Vanessa has the last question.
Sure.
Chelsea, just one question. I was wondering how do you feel that your education prepared you for the position that you have now?
I think it prepared me well in the sense that I'm pretty equipped to understand the technical elements of something. For me, the challenge was learning how to communicate that in situations where there are either high emotions, as there was in Flint, for understandable reasons, and also, what is the core tenet of what that technical element is saying? How can I make that resonate with someone that isn't, they don't care about, what is the composition of orthophosphate, for example, when we're talking about water. Finding that core message. So it's not, orthophosphate this or that. It's they didn't add the protective chemical that would make it so that the lead didn't leach into the water. So I think for me, learning the communication element was a little bit easier than learning the technical element. So I felt like I was a little more equipped to adapt to that after I left school.
All right. Thank you, Daniel and Chelsea. It's 5. Thank you very much for coming. I know our group is going to continue. If you want to stay over the time, we will enjoy that and of our communications about what we thought. And now I'll pass it to Eric.
Well, in addition to my own thank you to both Dan and Chelsea for their time, we have to recognize Carlos for being an amazing moderator who got all the information we needed from our panelists and made sure that all of our group was able to ask their questions. So thank you, Carlos. And I so thoroughly echo Dan and Chelsea's comments about pursuing opportunities at the fellowship level for some of our graduate students and paid internships like what Dan mentioned at his own organization, and networking, because networking is why Dan and Chelsea are both here today. At some point, 2 years ago, an email came into my inbox about some sort of volunteer opportunity for students, and it was where Chelsea was working at the time. And I took the chance to reach out and say, hey, Chelsea, would love to know more about you and her current organization at the time. And now that paid off for 2 years later. And, you know, Dan, I was just doing research on this particular topic and came across him and his organization, and he's here today. So, you know, you all can engage in that too with those you meet this week and outside of that as well. Thank you both again.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to meet everybody.
Thank you
so
guys.
much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
So it was a great day one, in my opinion. Very proud of you all, and it was great to see all the different resources and opportunities and papers and internships that were sent in the chat here. I already sent, right as this session was starting, an important email about sending me your reflections from day one. This is not something to sit down and take extra time on. This is just there. This is what I thought, as well as some important login information about tomorrow morning. The morning sessions are on a different link, but then we go back to this link. Told you what to look out for in terms of a meeting invite from FIU and DC Zoom, and you can reach out to my colleague Alex. Generally speaking, do people seem to have gotten this Zoom link to be a panelist tomorrow? So you'll use that for both the 8:30 session and the 9 o'clock session are all on that link. The 8:30 session is just a exclusive chat between you and a very cool panelist who I sent an article. You can read about him before the open to the public part begins. So I'll let you guys get some rest now. After a great day, we'll find some time after our lobbying session to debrief on both our energy session just now and that lobbying session. Any last minute questions or concerns about day one and or what to do to get started for tomorrow?
I just wanted to applaud the moderators today. You guys did a really amazing job. Yeah.
Could not agree more. And it's great for me because I just get to sit here and enjoy. So thank you, amazing moderators. And I know we have another great group of moderators tomorrow. Thanks for bringing that up. All right. Thank you all. We'll see you bright and early tomorrow. I'm very proud of you all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.